day for work here at the Happy Healthy Workplace podcast. I'm Kimberly Ficklin, your host. And every week we talk to professionals just like you all around the world because we want to find out what they do to create a profitable business, the kind of business where people really want to work. Today, we're talking to Barbara Zabawa again, and if you have forgotten from episode 5, Barbara is a national wellness lawyer with the Center for Health and Wellness Law, LLC. They are the go-to law firm for health and wellness industries. The center provides legal advice, resources, trainings, and advocacy to help health and wellness startup or existing companies operate in compliance. Today, Barbara's going to share with us the laws around incentivizing your health and wellness program. Now, in episode 5 about wellness compliance law, Barbara shared with us that there was going to be some upcoming changes to the regulations by the EEOC that we needed to be aware of. Well, that has since been postponed until later this year, but the conversation still needs to go on. So with that said, Barbara, welcome.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So let's dive right in. Why don't you go ahead and share with us some of the things you've been speaking about in the last month or so since we talked last?
Yes, well, incentives especially tied to workplace wellness programs, doesn't seem to ever get old. People who work in the workplace wellness space are constantly asking for information about the use of incentives. That's understandable. I just completed some research over the last year through my position at UW-Milwaukee and shared with it recently through a webinar the results. And that research indicates that incentives work, at least in the short term. They do get people involved with various program offerings in the workplace. The question for the legal side of things is whether the incentives, when they're tied in particular to health information collection, are making people feel like they have no choice but to give up their health information in exchange of earning the incentive. But when tying it to other types of activities, and Kim and I were talking briefly before we started this podcast about book clubs or other kinds of well-being type of activities that maybe aren't directly related to healthcare, people would probably welcome those kinds of incentives to participate in a variety of activities. And the law would not be implicated, at least the laws that we normally talk about in this space, which is Americans with Disabilities Act and GINA. And so people welcome incentives, or at least, will act upon incentives. And some people will feel that they are almost being encouraged strongly to participate when they wouldn't otherwise because of incentives.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think after the last time we spoke, my husband had just changed jobs, and we got one of those incentives for, I want to say it's like a discount on our insurance through his work if I sign up to this certain thing. And he's hounding me, he's like, sign up. And I'm going, okay, I'll do it. And I looked at it, and first of all, there was so many things. I thought there's no way I'll ever do any of this. I mean, quite literally, I probably won't do 2 of the 20 things they asked me to do. And I thought, how ridiculous is that? First of all, there's way too many things, right? But I did feel like he was feeling pressure. I don't know that he was, but I certainly was feeling pressure from him to do it, right? Like, because this is this incentive that we're going to get out of it. Mm-hmm. But then when I looked at it, there was so much stuff. I was like, okay, who really does this? And when they do they feel obligated to do it?
Mm-hmm. And according to our research, and I'll throw out this caveat, our research looked at one hospital system in northern Wisconsin that employs about 1,000 people. So it's one example. So you can't possibly assume that all workplaces are going to have similar results. But what we found in our survey of employees, when asking them questions about whether their employer should get involved with their wellness, whether the incentives were something that they felt encouraged them to participate, and what level of incentive encouraged them to participate. We found that regardless of income, so our survey respondents had incomes that ranged from very small incomes to the C-suites, the executives who were making over $250,000 a year. And even people who are in the higher income brackets found that even a $5 incentive could feel like that's something that they can't pass up. So that was a very interesting finding. And because a lot of the analysis that's been done by the courts with regard to incentives when tying it to health information collection is that people in lower income brackets might feel more coerced into participating because of an incentive than people in higher income brackets. And our research showed that income really didn't impact the perception of the incentive like we thought it would.
Wow, that's interesting because I would have thought it would as well.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is one workplace, so the results may differ in another workplace. But in our survey, that was what the conclusion was.
Well, it's interesting to think. I mean, incentives are definitely a driver to do something. That's why you put an incentive in place. It's interesting that you say even the smallest little bit of incentive, because when I used to work, I was in marketing and sales. And I would say all the time on the sales floor that if you really want to get a bunch of people, salespeople specifically, working hard, put some small little tiny thing for all of them to get after. And you're going to see everybody work hard. And it was funny because like you say, it could be something, $20 or lunch out at the subway or something, but you've never seen people work harder to get some small piece of something because really, and I'm not quite sure really what that draw about it is, whether it's a little bit of competition and it's fun as well, and who's going to win it, especially if there's only maybe one or two or only a couple people can win.
Yeah, well, and we also found that one of the questions we asked our survey respondents was, if you didn't have the incentive, would you still participate in the program? Most of them said they would, but I would say about 40% of the respondents said they would not participate if there was not any incentive tied to whatever they were being asked to participate in.
And even a small incentive.
Yeah. Our questions didn't delineate small versus large. We just said, if there was no incentive, would you still participate? Yes or no? And 60%, I think, said yes, they'd still participate. And 40% said, no, we're not going to participate.
That's really interesting. It is. That's a great study. What made you decide to, obviously that's what you do in your work, but what made you decide to do a study specifically for this?
Well, it was the AARP case. So if you remember, the whole reason we talked about the EEOC rules at the outset of this podcast and our last podcast was because the AARP, which is a consumer advocacy organization, for lack of a better description, sued the EEOC for coming up with these incentive rules that, said you can incentivize employees up to 30% of the total cost of self-only coverage when you're collecting their health information. And we as the EEOC would not perceive that to be something that an employee would perceive to be mandatory. We think 30% of the total cost of self-only coverage would still be considered a voluntary choice for employees to participate. And the AARP said, no way that is not voluntary, especially for individuals who are in lower incomes. And the court agreed with the AARP and said, the EEOC needs to really provide some justification for why it chose 30% and why it thinks that most employees, if not all employees, would view 30% of the total cost of self-only coverage as a voluntary incentive, that there should be studies about this. So basically the court was calling for studies. Right. And so we decided to do a study and ask employees at this one hospital, how do they feel about different incentive amounts? How do they feel about it when it's tied to their giving health information versus when it's not tied to giving health information? And interestingly, the employees didn't differ too much. They viewed the incentive the same, whether it was tied to giving up their health information or whether it was tied to some other activity that didn't relate to their health information. If they felt like the incentive was coercive, they were going to feel that most likely regardless of whether it was related to their health information or not. And again, income levels did not really matter. That was not a significant factor in the responses that we received from the survey respondents.
What was the most, if there was anything, what was the most shocking or surprising result out of that survey for you?
Well, I think the fact that it wasn't related to income. That,
yeah.
That you could have a high income and still perceive even a small incentive as, coercive, which when tied to health information collection is illegal under the ADA. So I think a big takeaway from this survey is don't assume anything. If you really want to understand what your employees will react to and how they perceive incentives in your wellness program, survey them. Survey them like we surveyed this group in northern Wisconsin. At least if you have a survey and the results of the survey and base your program design on those results, you at least have some justification for why you're doing what you're doing, which is more than what the EEOC apparently had when they got sued by the AARP. So it's probably a good idea.
Yeah, this comes up a lot. I mean, just about every interview for this podcast is surveying your employees and getting feedback. I think we're getting better at that in the workplace. Previously, honestly, in my corporate jobs, I can't ever remember taking a single survey, caring about what I thought, really, honestly. But I know that we're changing. That's obviously why I do this podcast and why I'm getting people like you in front of workplaces and employers, is because things are changing. And it is important that we care about what our employees think, not only because we care and it shows them that we care, but because we could have really bad business models, really bad programs, and really bad incentives that are not working for us or our employees when we don't know what they want and we just put things in place because we think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. And is that just not undermining the whole point of having a wellness program in the first place?
It is. And now the C-suite's stressed out over their wellness program. And that's really why I talk a lot more about total worker health and well-being, rather than focusing, because we did. And that's another thing is that we focus so long on wellness programs and they're directed at health, right? And they're directed at chronic illness and exercising and eating right and those kind of things. But there's a much bigger picture, but there's a broader sense of things that can make your employees happy and healthy than just health and wellness. And when we survey our employees, we really get to have them help us to design programs that work for our workplace and the employees that we've hired for it.
Right.
Yeah.
And having, a happy, healthy workplace, just like your podcast title, is the whole point. So if it's not, your employees aren't really interested in the poking and the prodding, and I know there's been a lot of criticism on that kind of activity and data collection, but they welcome other ideas like book clubs or, other kinds of more diverse activities that get at other facets of well-being that would be helpful to the employer and the employees. And then you're kind of steering away from, other concerns when you are collecting data of privacy and security of that data. And there's a lot of consternation about what's being done with the data once it's collected. So, moving away from that may not be a bad thing for your workforce. But if that is still something that your workforce welcomes, great. Just, I would say, be more transparent about any data collection and storage and use once the data is collected, because that's another important aspect of all of this is employee privacy. And that's another theme that was kind of running through the AARP case is, all these incentives were tied to health information collection, and the employees were presumably, or the AARP was assuming that the employees would be upset because that was an invasion of their privacy. And if you're going to give me money in exchange for my data, you better know what amount of money is still feeling voluntary when it comes to the release of data.
Yeah, that's so interesting to be able to put like just a 30%, because I'm sure that each person could individually fill completely a different percentage, I would guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I don't think the EEOC is going to try to come up with another number. I think they will. By, what I've read and kind of in between the lines, my understanding is that there's still a belief by the EEOC that some dollar amount could still be considered voluntary, and that overall the industry is looking for that kind of simple guidance. What dollar amount can we use as a guide for structuring our incentives? So, even though a lot of forward thinkers in the wellness, well-being industry kind of frown upon incentives and think that we should be moving on and not talking about incentives, the EEOC, and I think a lot of others in the industry, still think incentives are needed, useful. Certainly our research showed that it encourages participation, at least in the short term. Whether it encourages good results is another question. But incentives are still something that a lot of people want. And I think the EEOC is going to respond to that by issuing rules with some kind of number or amount.
Well, I guess they would have to, right? I love that you are sharing with us, though, that incentives, at least from the survey that you've done, are still working and that people are believing that, because you touched on something where people are moving away from it. And I think, like, as consultants, as wellness consultants, as corporate wellness people, I think probably are encouraging people to move away from incentives just to not get stuck in this legal sticky wicket. But what you're saying is you really don't have to get rid of the incentives. You just really need to, if you have them in your workplace, in your programs, you need to really take a good look at them and make sure that they're in compliance.
Yeah, and that they're going to give you the results that you want. That's interesting that you say people are moving away from incentives in part because they just don't want to have to deal with the law. If incentives are truly going to work, at least at the outset, and getting people to start work, with the wellness program. I mean, it may not keep them there, but at least it maybe get them to the starting line, if you will. I can tell you that the government certainly isn't opposed to incentives. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do the survey, and it sounds like you can do a survey for all kinds of different reasons, not just for a compliance standpoint, but just from a program success standpoint. If you do that survey and you have the background, the evidence to show that this is why you did what you did, if someone should ever complain, you're going to be in such a better position to defend why you did what you did in front of any sort of authority, government authority or judicial authority.
That is definitely the tip of this interview. That's great. That's a really good thing to know, because I guess I wouldn't have ever thought about that. You could utilize your survey. Yeah, that's great.
It's a great piece of evidence. I mean,
that's the tip of the day.
Yeah. I mean, so it not only gives you insight into what your employees want, it's showing that you took the extra step and did your due diligence before moving forward with whatever your program design is.
That's great. So survey.
Yeah.
It gets brought up again. It's all about feedback. I mean, really, honestly, if you want your employees to be engaged, it is about their feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So surveying is going to keep you in compliance. It's going to keep you with your programs the way they need to be, and you have happy and healthy employees. So it's a win-win, as usual.
Yes, for sure.
Well, that's great. Barbara, it's always good to have a conversation with you about these compliance laws. I think people really need to know what you have to share with them. In closing, is there anything that you think needed to be said today that we didn't say?
No, but just as a reminder, stay tuned for later in the year, December to be exact, when the EEOC says it will propose new rules for incentive use under the ADA and GINA. So I'm sure we'll be back to talk about those new proposed rules when they come out later this year or early next, if we don't get a chance to talk in December when they do come out.
Yeah, for sure. We will be setting that up and keeping in touch with you between now and then in case any other thing needs to be said that's important. So again, Barbara, it's a great conversation to have you on here. I appreciate your time as usual. Thanks for being a friend and a guest of the show.
Happy to do it. Thank you, Kim.
That's a wrap for today. The Happy Healthy Workplace podcast is now complete. Be sure to subscribe and join us weekly for secrets, solutions, or strategies that help you create a profitable business where people really want to work. This is Kimberly Ficklin, wishing you a happy, healthy day.